I was very happy when the announcement came on the Bradley fighting vehicles and the Strikers. I think those are very good for the kinds of operational, fast tempo, quiet maneuver that Ukraine, I think, will have to conduct in the late winter and the spring. Corruption is unfortunately an element of every government in the world. And it's critically important for all leaders like President Zelensky to make sure that those individuals who are deemed to be corrupt are thrown out of the government and made an example of. But I'd only say that Ukraine has to take a little bit, the Ukraine people have to take a little bit of an appetite suppressant in their feeling that these tanks are going to be on the ground tomorrow. It's going to take a while to not only train Ukrainian tankers on them, but get the support element in place. So it may be weeks or maybe even months. And I hope that we can get the Ukraine military can have them incorporated in time for their offensive operations in the spring.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. You're listening and watching Rashkin Report. My name is Yuri Rashkin, and I couldn't be more excited to welcome to our program General Mark Hertling. General is a retired general, but at one point he served as the commanding general of the United States Army Europe and the 7th Army. General Hertling, it's an honor to welcome you to Rashkin Report.
It is a pleasure to be with you, Yuri, and I've heard so many great things about this report from my dear friend, General Ben Hodges.
It's just a list of honor. It's fantastic. So let's get to things, because I think one of the amazing opportunities here that I really would excited about is to take the things that you're going to say and then translate them into Russian so that Russian speakers world over, including those that have some decision-making powers, could hear you directly, which I think is just priceless considering the situation that we're in. So let's begin. Let's take a look at Putin's strategic objectives and how the military has failed in meeting the operational and tactical requirements. How do you see the situation right now, General?
Well, from the very beginning, I don't know what Mr. Putin had in mind as his strategic objectives, but early on in the conflict, I kind of thought that there were 5 different things that he was interested in doing. First of all, he was looking at executing regime change in Kyiv, getting rid of President Zelensky. Number 2, destroy Ukraine's army, and he was trying to do that in a series of ways. Number 3, he was trying to subjugate Ukraine's population. Number 4, control all of the Black and Azov seaports and establish a land bridge, not just to Crimea, but perhaps beyond, through Odessa and maybe into the Transnistria region of Moldova. And then finally, I think, whereas this is not a military objective, I believe one of his strategic requirements was to further create divisions within NATO and take advantage of what he perceived to be a divisiveness in the United States. Now, from a military perspective, as a commander on the ground, what I used to do is take my senior leader, civilian leaders' strategic objectives and try and place them in an operational context. So knowing that those 5 things were Mr. Putin's political and strategic objectives, if I'm assuming right, then as a military commander, I think I would have built a campaign plan, which we saw on the ground. The main effort was directed toward Kyiv and attempting to displace the Zelensky government. The secondary effort, I think, was to conduct a battle of annihilation in the eastern part of the Donbass, where he would surround the Ukrainian army that he believed was defending out there. The majority of the Ukrainian army that I think he perceived were defending out there. At the same time, he wanted to conduct his secondary effort. Another secondary effort was a rush toward the ports of Odessa and potentially even an amphibious assault. Early on in the stages of the campaign, I watched very closely what the Russian naval infantry and the Russian Navy was doing, because I thought that there would eventually be an amphibious assault into the city of Odessa. And then the final one is expand the landmass of the Donbass up to the Dnipro River. If you look at all those things from a military perspective and having commanded large organizations on the ground, I would have attempted to done what we in the U.S. military call a troop to task requirement. How many soldiers do we have? How many units do we have? What kinds of things are we asking them to do? Not only the military operations of seizing and securing objectives, but also establishing governments after you do those kind of things. And what I thought from the very beginning, that the estimated force of 190,000 Russian troops that were around the eastern border of Ukraine, as well as the north and the south, were just not nearly enough to conduct the many tasks that he had given his army. You add to that the fact that personally I've seen the Russian army in training and in exercises, and I knew from the very beginning that they did not have the capability to accomplish the kinds of objectives that they would have been asked to do. It was pretty interesting to me to watch the operations, because I thought the Russian army would have a better coordination between both the land, ground, and naval forces. They did not. I'm sorry, the land, air, and naval forces. They did not. I thought that there would be an increased use of cyber activity. The Ukrainian defense prevented that. And the alleged asymmetric warfare that General Gerasimov is reported to be such an expert at just did not seem to contribute to this campaign at all. So from an overall view, from my perspective as a former senior commander in another military, this was a dysfunctional attack, and it was a debacle from the very first day.
How do you see the difference between the General Gerasimov, General Surovikin, General, doesn't matter what the name is, can they change the course of this war?
I don't believe they can, for a variety of reasons. First of all, they have a mismatch between how they train their soldiers and what their doctrinal context is. But in addition to that, I think there is problems in leadership with the Russian army. The Russian academies, the Frunze Academy, Voroshilov, used to be well known around the world as being able to train and educate senior military leaders in the Russian army. And I think both of those academies have faltered in the last probably 2 decades. There has been an overwhelming corruption and grift in the senior ranks of the Russian army. And I think the fact that Russia has decided not to attempt to establish a professional army with sergeants and NCOs and trained junior officers, that has also contributed to their failure. Those are things you can't fix in a matter of weeks or months. Those kinds of actions to revamp the education, training, and doctrine system of a military take years. In addition to that, there's been a lot of messaging and advertisement of grand pieces of equipment in the Russian army, like the Armata tanks and some of the missile systems and some of the artillery pieces, as well as the precision weapons. And truthfully, this conflict has shown that none of those have come to fruition in terms of being capable on the modern battlefield.
One of the most important questions for, I think, our Ukrainian listeners and viewers is weapons. How much sooner or faster or more can we get Western American weapons? What is your view on the situation as it stands right now?
Well, again, I go back to my time as a commander, also as a commander in combat. When new weapon systems were fielded to my subordinate units in a combat environment, a much different combat environment, by the way, too. When I was in combat, it was not a high intensity conventional war with a lot of artillery fire and direct fire contact. It was an insurgency. But even attempting to field small amounts of new equipment to a unit that's in the fight proves difficult. For the Ukrainian army, the biggest concern I have is their ability to take the contributions from NATO and the US military, not only train their forces in the use of that equipment, but as you get into the more complex equipment, that contributes to combined arms warfare, then you also have the requirement to be in direct fire contact while you're trying to field those new pieces of equipment, and at the same time logistically support yourself. Ukraine has learned a lot in the first 11 months of this war, but I know for a fact, because of the intensity of this conflict, that both sides are experiencing problems with their readiness rates of their equipment and their ability of the troops to get supply and logistics to the front lines.
How do you see Abrams tanks fitting into this equation?
Yeah, I think there is a need for advanced Western tanks. The debate over the last several weeks has been Leopards or Abrams. I think we're getting to the point in the last few days where Leopards are going to be donated by some of the 13 nations in NATO that have those tanks. In terms of the Abrams tank, because of the characteristics of that vehicle, it's going to be a lot more difficult to incorporate that into the Ukrainian army. There are indicators within the last couple of hours that an announcement's going to be made soon about the contributions of Abrams to the Ukrainian army. But I think that's going to be over the long term. This is part of the overall transformation of the Ukrainian force for the future, because it will take months, not days or weeks, to incorporate an Abrams, not only the tank and the crew training, but also the logistics and the sustainment requirements into the Ukrainian military. So I think that could be the promise of tanks for the long-term future, to help transform the Ukrainian army into a modern force, much like the United States provided or is providing Abrams tanks to the Polish army. In the past, they've provided them to a small element of the Iraqi and Saudi Arabian army, but it's taken years to incorporate those vehicles as well as a sustainment system.
What about the reputation of Abrams as being, I guess, sensitive, heavy piece of equipment that may not be best suited for that theater like Ukraine?
Well, I don't think that's an issue at all. I think if you had trained tankers and a supported logistics system and the maintainers that could ensure that those vehicles kept running, yeah, the Abrams is a little bit heavier. It's 72 tons versus the 66 tons or so of a Leopard, a Leopard, and the 40 tons or so of a T-72. But I think a trained crew using the Abrams system would be devastating on the battlefield inside of Ukraine.
What about going back to that number of Russian troops invading? It seemed like it was going to be insufficient number, like you said, to conduct a full invasion, but it seems to be a sufficient number to have a policy of genocide, where they basically are fighting with the civilian population and they're displacing civilian population. That's a different way than I think our military is expecting an enemy to even fight. How do we handle this? What do we do about it when our enemy shows such a different approach to warfare?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it also plays into a changing strategy by Mr. Putin of attacking the civilian population as well as the military, because he was not that successful in attacking the Ukrainian military. So he shifted to attempt to persuade the will of the Ukrainian people to surrender. That has not worked. But in the process, as you just stated, he's killed literally thousands of Ukrainian innocent civilians. My read and my understanding of the law of land warfare and the 4 protocols of the Geneva Convention is that Mr. Putin and his entire military has violated every element of the Geneva Convention of 1949. So when you talk about the potential for the future, this is just another contributor to Russia being a pariah on the world stage, because they have committed, in my view, multiple instances of war crimes, not only in terms of the attacks on civilian infrastructure and civilian dwelling places and universities and hospitals, but the additional fact in the reporting of the kidnapping of literally hundreds of Ukrainian children and displacing them to Russia, taking them away from their parents. There can be no more criminal action than that, other than the rapes and mutilation of Ukrainian citizens that have also been conducted by the Russian soldiers and their leaders.
If we're looking at a military crime, then military tribunal would seem to be the appropriate direction where this is headed. Do you see this as the final outcome for Putin, or how do you see him ending?
I absolutely do. And I think it should be the final outcome. It should be the final outcome, or it should be the outcome for anyone that uses these kinds of strategies or tactics when you're talking about the execution of warfare. The very nature of the invading of a foreign country without provocation could also be considered an act of criminality. So yeah, I definitely believe that Mr. Putin and many of his senior leaders should be tried in a military tribunal in the Hague.
General Hertling, if you agree that these are crimes, perhaps crimes against humanity, at what point do you think NATO will feel it is appropriate to get involved, and rather than simply send weapons and armaments and supplies, to actually get involved with boots on the ground? Do you see such point? And is there, like, at what point would we go to that stage?
I personally don't see that, but I think there might be some courses of action that Mr. Putin might take that would create an impetus for NATO becoming involved in a more overt way. The use of, as an example, weapons of mass destruction, either chemical or nuclear, the continued attacks across borders, like potentially into Moldova, and in an attempt to connect with the Transnistria breakaway republic. But I don't know. I really don't want to answer that question, because the NATO alliance is meant to be a security alliance for the member nations. And unfortunately, right now, Ukraine is not a member nation. I think they will be in the future to prevent this kind of attack in the long term. But right now, I don't see NATO becoming involved in the landmass of Ukraine beyond some extremely unique circumstances.
How do you feel about the level of help that we've provided so far? It's obviously, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of equipment, but it is not sufficient yet to stop the war. Even most optimistic analytics look at this year as being done, as being potentially the end of the war comes to an end. How do you look at that deadline, and what do you think about the level of military support that we're providing to Ukraine at this time?
Well, one of the things that I have not done is said any put any predictions on the war when it may end. It could end tomorrow. It could end in a year. It could end in 2 years. But I personally believe Ukraine is going to achieve their strategic objectives, and I think those strategic objectives, more than likely, I can't speak for President Zelensky, but he has said it many times that he wants to regain the territorial integrity of the nation of Ukraine, to include the Crimea. So I don't know when it will end. To get to your first question of have we provided enough, I think the Western nations have provided an awful lot. When you talk about literally the numbers of pieces of equipment, the billions of dollars in not just military aid, but societal aid, it has been significant to have a country that's not part of an alliance receive that much assistance from both an alliance and from partner nations as well. In order to win this war, I think there's a repeated call by President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people to arm us to the full extent of a transformed Western military. That's very difficult to do while you're fighting in combat. And I think Secretary Austin, when he has convened the Ramstein contact group on now, I think, 7 occasions, he has repeatedly placed the goal of providing Ukraine with the equipment that they can immediately put to use, which will have a positive effect on the battlefield, and which Ukraine can easily sustain. So when you look at those constraining factors of being put immediately to use, have a positive effect right now, and which they can sustain, that kind of limits the ability to provide Ukraine with everything that they are asking for. Because from a commander's perspective, I'm not a politician, but a commander's perspective, it's very difficult to transform an army while you're in combat. And I think that's what Ukraine would like to see happen. But from the standpoint of placing too much burden on Ukraine, it would be very difficult to do that.
Right. From the point of view of nuclear threat, we have to touch upon that. I know you're being asked about this all the time, but it seems like the situation is also changing slightly, because Putin's been speaking about using possibly nuclear weapons since the third day of the war, I believe.
Right.
And we've been always very concerned about escalation and nuclear ladder and all of those things. But yet now we're looking at a very serious level of help, which seems like we are less concerned about this escalation. Are we less concerned about nuclear escalation?
Personally, I am less concerned about nuclear escalation, but that also doesn't matter what I think. And here's why I say that. If I make a wrong call as a citizen living in the United States right now, that, I don't believe, I could hand wave and say, I don't believe Putin will ever use nuclear weapons. I have assumed a risk as an individual citizen, and it doesn't matter what I say. There's only one person that really assumes that risk, and it's really a gamble, and that's President Biden and the members of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. So if they guess wrong, I mean, I could guess that Putin's not going to do it, but if they guess wrong, potentially tens of thousands of people could die. So they have to always bear in mind that consideration, that for all the crazy things that Mr. Putin has already done, could he do one more crazy thing and use nuclear weapons? And I have to think that they would have to assume there is at least a percentage of a chance that he might do that. So they have to be wary of that.
Considering the risk that Mr. Putin presents to the entire world, why haven't the United States taken him out like Osama bin Laden? I don't want to get into the politics of assassinating the leader of a terrorist organization versus another nation assassinating the leader of a government, but I think that plays a part. If there's I don't believe the United States has a policy of decapitation of high levels of government. And I don't think personally or I do think that that's a moral issue that's always under consideration. I know we're a little, running short on time. Do you have still a few minutes?
Sure.
Great. Are there weapons that you feel are needed by Ukraine right now that the United States should be supplying that we're not currently supplying?
I was very happy when the announcement came on the Bradley fighting vehicles and the Strikers. I think those are very good for the kinds of operational, fast tempo, quiet maneuver that Ukraine, I think, will have to conduct in the late winter and the spring. I'm concerned about the transfer of tanks. It doesn't matter what kind, because I know what kind of training and support goes into tanks. I think that the Western alliances have provided the kinds of air defense equipment that they possibly could, again, to meet those three requirements that we just talked about, that Secretary Austin did. I know Ukraine would like to stop every single missile or drone that comes across the territory, but I also know from a military perspective that stopping every single one would be nigh impossible. And I got to give great kudos to the Ukrainian military and the territorial defense forces for what they have stopped. It has continued to amaze me to see the numbers of drones and missiles that have been shot down by a force that doesn't have a universal approach to air defense. They have been plugging in different types of air defense, and they have been masterful in their ability to defend their skies. Unfortunately, some of those drones and missiles have gotten through and killed innocent civilians on a mass scale.
And I should take the opportunity to thank you and American military and all Americans from every Ukrainian for all the help that is being provided, that will be provided, you know, that has been provided. What about
I'm sorry, yes. I forgot. I'm because I'm so Army centric. I was talking about all the land vehicles, and I should state that I believe that it's probably going on right now. I'm not going to comment on that, but I think that Ukrainian pilots should receive training on advanced fighter aircraft. The type is unimportant, but it's not just the fighter aircraft that's needed. It's the refueling capability, the electronic jamming capability for those fighter aircrafts, and the targeting capabilities for those aircrafts in other aircrafts, as well as transport planes. And then if you go to the third branch of service, the Navy, I think that's going to be another long-term consideration of rebuilding a naval force for Ukraine to defend their ports and in the Black and Azov Sea.
With that in mind, what do you think about Moscow, the anti-air defense systems being placed around Moscow, protecting FSB, Putin's residence supposedly? What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that it is a great indicator of how anxious the leaders in Moscow and other Russian locations are to insurgent activities and activities by people who don't agree with what their governments are doing. I think a combination of special operations as well as unrest within the Russian regime is causing a lot of explosions and a lot of concern to the key leaders in many cities in the Russian Federation.
Sir, you had the opportunity to observe Russian and Ukrainian soldiers training, and you made some references already, but is there more that you'd like to say that you feel is important for understanding of this war?
Yeah, I think what I saw in the Russian force really centered around corruption and grift. In the early days of working with Ukraine's military, I saw some of the same corruption as well. But starting in the early 2000s, I would say probably around 2006, 7, 8, there was a tremendous intent to eradicate corruption from within the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian military. My counterpart in Ukraine's military was a guy named Colonel General Hennady Vorobyov. We became very good friends in the period 2011 and 2012 and had some very candid and transparent discussions with one another. And one of Colonel General Vorobyov's key issues was he wanted to ensure that he rid the Ukrainian military of corrupt general officers who had been trained in the Soviet model. And he attempted to do that in his couple of final years as the commander of Ukraine's forces. General Vorobyov is died in 2017. Much to my chagrin, he was a good friend, but I think he started to build a general officer corps in the Ukrainian army that had the same approach that he did in terms of very patriotic, nationalistic servants of their sovereign territory. I know today there was some media reports of a couple of individuals who President Zelensky relieved of their responsibilities because of corruption. What I would say, and what I just said on CNN a few minutes ago, was corruption is unfortunately an element of every government in the world. And it's critically important for all leaders like President Zelensky to make sure that those individuals who are deemed to be corrupt are thrown out of the government and made an example of. So the changes in Ukraine's government and military have been monumental over the last decade and a half, whereas in the Russian military, it's only gotten worse. And that's because of, a criminal kleptocrat at the head of the regime, and that's Mr. Putin.
Just now, it came across the wires that Germany will send Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. German newspaper reports, according to CNN, Parliament is still due to debate the issue on Wednesday. What happened there? Do you see? Is this like a peer pressure, diplomatic pressure, understanding of the situation as it really is? What happened?
I think it's probably several things. I think it was the requirement to debate within the German chancellery. The German Bundestag has a very diverse set of politicians, and they have different views from different elements of the spectrum. And Chancellor Scholz was doing the best he could to represent all of the members of his chancellery. I think there was probably some diplomatic pressure put on Germany to allow other countries to deliver their Leopards. The result, I think, is a good thing, but I'd only say that Ukraine has to take a little bit, the Ukraine people have to take a little bit of an appetite suppressant in their feeling that these tanks are going to be on the ground tomorrow. It's going to take a while to not only train Ukrainian tankers on them, but get the support element in place. So it may be weeks or maybe even months. And I hope that we can get the Ukraine military can have them incorporated in time for their offensive operations in the spring.
General, how do you see this ending for Russia? How do you see Russia after this war?
Yeah, Yuri, that's a question I often am asked, and I don't know. There are so many variants that could happen. There could be a retreat by Mr. Putin of his forces to get out of Ukraine. There could be additional unfortunate and horrific killings of literally hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers as well, where the war continues. There could be an uprising inside of Moscow in the Kremlin. There could be a military coup. I just don't know. And it could happen tomorrow, or it could happen in a year's time or any time in between. These are the things that happen in warfare and in these kind of adventures when someone like Mr. Putin makes a very bad move and invades a sovereign country that has a will to maintain their sovereignty.
How do you estimate the strength of American support for Ukraine at this point, politically speaking? It's an important question. There's, politicians have to take votes. What do you think?
I believe right now the backing for the Ukrainian people is very high. Unfortunately, I would have to say sometimes my country has a very short attention span. And I'm hoping that as Ukraine continues to fight in very tough conditions, that the messaging of the importance of this fight continues within the United States and in all the Western countries and all of NATO. I'm very concerned about an element within our government that seems to be extremist, that perhaps doesn't understand the value of what Ukraine is doing right now and the criminality of Russia's actions. I'm concerned about that within our government. But I think I'm an optimist, and I always believe that good will prevail for the right reasons. So I'm hoping that certainly the United States stays in lockstep with the Ukrainian people and continuing to support their quest for sovereignty.
Retired General Mark Hertling, it's been a privilege and an honor to speak with you. Thank you for spending these few minutes with us, and we'll get to translating the information for our Russian-speaking viewers worldwide. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Yuri. Thank you, and thanks for all you're doing.